The people, the headlines, the issues impacting you, all on This Week in Cincinnati on 9 on your side.
Welcome back, everyone. Today on This Week in Cincinnati, my one-on-one interview with Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. He's been a frequent critic, that is, of nominations by President Trump, and the president's new nomination for the Federal Reserve Board, Stephen Moore, is no exception. The Federal Reserve sets short-term interest rates and oversees the regulation of the financial system. Its members serve 14-year terms. So a recent comment by Moore caught the attention of a lot of people here in Cincinnati.
If you live in the Midwest, where else do you want to live besides Chicago, right? You don't want to live in Cincinnati or Cleveland or, these, armpits of America like that. You want to live in Chicago, right?
Stephen Moore made his remarks while talking at the Heartland Institute. His comment about Cincinnati and Cleveland was made while praising Chicago as a vital part of the U.S. economy. So I asked Senator Brown what he thinks about Moore's remarks and Moore's nomination. You've demanded an apology from a Federal Reserve Board of Governors nominee, Stephen Moore. He has called Cleveland and Cincinnati the armpits of America. So how's that going?
Well, I don't think he'll apologize. I mean, I invite him to come to Cincinnati and look at NIOSH and look at Cincinnati Children's and look at GE Engines and look at Procter & Gamble and look at the Hebrew Union College and look at all the things that Cincinnati's led the world in, led the state, led the country, led the world. So, I mean, it tells me that's not the worst thing he's done. The worst thing he's done is, well, what he said about women. But even as bad as that is his policies. His policies will ignore places like this. I mean, he would call this flyover country. He just doesn't have a regard for working families in Ohio, and I don't want him on the Federal Reserve for that reason.
Does his statement make him unqualified?
There are so many things that make him unqualified. That statement contributes to it, but that statement speaks an attitude of his disregard for working families of all races, people that struggle, people that whether they're making $30,000 or $100,000 a year, but where it's hard for people to pay their bills, hard for them to make a living, dealing with plant closures or dealing with layoffs or dealing with just high expenses, which so many in this community deal with. And he just has shown no regard for people that have ordinary problems.
Ohio is such an important presidential election state. So what does it say about a president who would turn him into a nominee for such an important position?
I don't understand why the president's chosen him. The president has chosen for a number of these jobs in the financial services sector to regulate, to keep the banks from fleecing people, to make sure that the government doesn't bail out the banks again. The president essentially has betrayed working class Americans consistently with his tax policy, with his trade policy, with his appointments to the courts. I mean, he's appointed a Supreme Court that puts its thumb on the scales of justice to choose corporations over workers, to choose Wall Street over consumers, and to choose insurance companies over sick people. I mean, the president has consistently sided with the rich against working Americans, and that betrayal is what will ultimately cost him the election next year.
Speaking of the election, right now we have a crazy amount of Democrats who have thrown their hat in the ring and said, I want to be president. You dabbled with that. You took your toe in the water. Are you sorry that you decided not to?
My intent starting in an election night when I was reelected with third term last November was to begin to inform the debate and affect the narrative for whoever the Democratic nominee is, and that is to talk about the dignity of work and honoring and respecting work. That too often in this country, whether you punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether you work for tips or work in a salary, whether you're raising kids or taking care of an aging parent, too often policymakers, the economy, the government in Washington fails to respect and honor work, and no matter what you do. And I want to see Democratic candidates talking about respecting work and honoring work, and you contrast that with a president who's betrayed workers. And I don't know whom I'll endorse, if I even will, but I've talked to a number of candidates and want each one to talk about the dignity of work, and again, contrast that with a president who has betrayed workers time and time and time again in his life.
What does it say about the state of our union that so many people are saying, I can do it better?
Well, I think that there is so much anger about this president. Half the country probably more. I mean, this president's approval ratings have been lower than consistently any president in history, and I think a lot of Democrats are willing, or because they hear from so many people who are unhappy about the president's treatment of women, about the president's racism, about the president's betrayal of workers, about the president's the chaos in the White House that he just runs through staff. Nobody's very loyal to him for very long, and he's not loyal to them. I think that makes a lot of people think I can run this country better than this president. And frankly, I think most of them could.
You've been outspoken about wanting Ohio Republicans to speak out defending Obamacare, yet the governor and attorney general have really done so, at least to some degree. Dave Yost even filed a brief urging the court to not throw out protections for people with pre-existing conditions. So what more do you want them to do?
Well, I appreciate what David Yost did. What I want them to do is call the president and say, stop the attack on the Affordable Care Act. Stop underfunding the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Stop trying to take away Medicaid from hundreds of thousands of Ohioans that Governor Casey expanded. Real quick, I'll close with a story. I was at Talbot House one day in Cincinnati, and a gentleman sitting next to his grown daughter put his hand on her arm and said, if it weren't for Medicaid, my daughter would be dead. And how dare Republican after Republican, all of whom get insurance because of taxpayers, how dare they want to take insurance away from that family and hundreds of thousands of other families?
Let's go back to the Federal Reserve Board nominee, Stephen Moore, for just a moment. He told radio station WZFG AM that his opponents are, quote, they're pulling a Kavanaugh against me, referring to the contentious debate over Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. He went on to say that since his nomination was announced, he has been a victim of, quote, a kind of character assassination having nothing to do with economics.
The fundamental question, why did the Russians want this president, this candidate Trump, to win so badly? Why did the Russians want that?
Up next, what Senator Brown says about talk of impeaching President Trump and what Congress also needs to focus on.
The people, the headlines, the issues impacting you, all on This Week in Cincinnati on 9 on Your Side.